Hi, my name is Roman Harkowski. I'm a member of the IBM Worldwide Cloud Competitive Team. Today I would like to discuss WebSphere Application Server Competitive Positioning versus WebLogic, JBoss, and Tomcat. This is an extended version of the session that I did at IBM Interconnect 2016 conference in Las Vegas. You may want to look at the blog ibmadvantage.com. There are a lot of good articles and demos and tutorials and white papers on that blog that you can download. With that, let's get started. First of all, I'd like to discuss the popularity of Java because there are a lot of competitors that are talking about Java, and those that are not using Java, they're saying that Java is really not that popular anymore, which isn't true. If you look at the three latest popularity indexes for programming languages, you could see on all three Java has #1 position, including the TOB programming index, as well as the IEEE index, as well as the GitHub, and they're all using different methodologies. Some of them are using number of pages available on the web, others are using number of projects open on GitHub, or number of tutorials, number of Google searches, and those kinds of things. And you can see in all three cases, Java is really #1 in popularity, and it is still growing. It's not to say that other languages are not popular or not growing. They absolutely are, especially with the advent of microservices. The world becomes more and more diverse, but Java is certainly #1, and it is in a very, very strong position. Now let's look at the application server competitive landscape in general. First of all, what is application server? The application server is something that provides you with certain qualities of services and certain characteristics, operational characteristics, that allows you to run your business logic. And that business logic is being written, in case of WebSphere, in a Java programming language. And you run that business logic and you get the app server to support your scalability, provide the monitoring and management. So that is really middleware, and the middleware is an extension on top of the operating system. The middleware allows you to run the code with a certain level of abstraction, with a certain level of portability across multiple hardware platforms, multiple operating systems. What that means is really application server is something that runs your business apps, and there are many different ways to write business logic and run your business apps. There are certainly what I call Java anti-EE, anti-enterprise edition, the movement which is very popular, and they are using JSP servlet runtimes like Tomcat and Jetty, for instance, as a very lightweight runtimes, Java-based, but they're not using Java Enterprise Edition. In other words, they're saying, well, you don't need the full Java EE spec. You don't need EJBs, you don't need messaging, you don't need CDI, you don't need other things like perhaps RMI over IOP. And they might be right in some cases because, for instance, JCA and transactions and adapters and JTA XA transactions may not be needed for all of the applications, but they say if you need that on Tomcat and Spring, you can get it from elsewhere. And there are lots of different frameworks, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different frameworks that can run on Tomcat and Spring to fill the gaps of the missing functionality. Another camp is traditional application server Java Enterprise Edition competitors for WebSphere, WebLogic, and JBoss EAP, something that we will discuss today. Another camp is other programming languages that are not Java. JavaScript, Node.js, PHP, Ruby, Scala, Go, Python, you name it. There are lots and lots of languages and frameworks where you can build and run your applications. The other alternative to build and run your applications is in the cloud, and that's not to say you cannot run app server in the cloud, but in the cloud you have some new choices. So for instance, you can run it in Heroku or Google, Amazon with Lambda, or Salesforce.com, or many different other options. And it could be app server, or it could be event-driven programming, serverless programming. So there are many ways to write and run business logic. There's obviously Microsoft with C#, and there is a new breed of software that's called cluster management, which is really positioned as an operating system for the data center with Apache Mesos and other things, where in Kubernetes and Docker, and where you can write the business logic in any programming language. And if you run it, for instance, in the container, that means you can allow cluster management software to do some of the quality of services work for you, something that application server does for you as well. Now, that was bad news for WebSphere. The good news for WebSphere is that because of the microservices and because of the lightweight nature of WebSphere, you can now use Liberty App Server alongside or instead of many of those applications. So for instance, if you had in the past a lot of the skills invested in JavaScript or Ruby on Rails, and your Ruby on Rails does not scale and it's very hard to maintain and you don't really like it, then you don't have to move all at once. You can do little incremental function in WebSphere Liberty profile and run it as a microservice alongside with your Ruby on Rails application. And then eventually, if you like it, you can move more and more workload into the Liberty runtime, which is WebSphere application server. So microservices makes it easier to use whatever technology you like, whatever programming language you like. And we think that Liberty runtime is a perfect runtime. And the nice thing about Liberty is that it runs very well on-prem and it also runs very well in the cloud. So for instance, if you look at this left bottom part of the screen, there is a Liberty build pack for Heroku, Liberty build pack for IBM Bluemix, which is Cloud Foundry. You can run Liberty on Pivotal Cloud Foundry in the cloud or on-prem. There's Liberty on Amazon, on Azure, on Google. You can run it pretty much anywhere. On OpenShift, Red Hat OpenShift, we provided the Liberty build pack. You can run it on infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, you name it. So Liberty is very, very small and lightweight and powerful runtime that can enhance the application, and it gives you that portability. You want to run it on-prem? You can. If you want to run it in one of the clouds, you absolutely can. So that's a great flexibility and power. You can decide where you want to run. So that's a very powerful statement. Now, the way that we build WebSphere application server, and as a matter of fact, all of the IBM software, we're not starting from scratch. We're using that great intellectual capital and great projects that are available as open source. For instance, MQ uses over 30 open source packages. WebSphere App Server and Liberty Profile as well uses over 100 open source packages. IBM Worklight, over 100 open source packages. Big Insights, same thing. And we're not only using, it's not a one-way street. We're also contributing to a lot of the open source projects. And in some cases, we actually initiated these projects and we are the lead contributor. So if you look for instance, look at the JPA or look at some of the other frameworks, for instance, the Apache Arias or Geronimo or OpenJPA, Dojo, Eclipse. A lot of these things were originated by IBM. Eclipse is a great example, or Apache Tuscany, for instance. We're one of the lead contributors on Geronimo and many, many, many other projects. We have many thousands of IBMers working and contributing to open source, and we're not only contributing, but we are using that to build our products. So in that way, we're very similar to some of the purely open source vendors like Red Hat. They use a lot of open source as well in JBoss. The difference is they also open source JBoss core and the entire server itself, where we don't open source every part of Liberty or WebSphere application server. We open source only some parts of it, and we keep some of that internal proprietary source code. That's not to be confused with open standards. So sometimes I see there's a confusion. People say open standards or open source, but they really mean the other thing. So open standard is something that is standardized. And you don't have to be open source to support open standards. So for instance, WebSphere App Server supports HTTP protocol. That's a standard, and it doesn't have to be open source implementation. Or another standard is Java Enterprise Edition. That is a standard. We do implement it and we support it, but we don't open source every part of it. although OpenJPA is also standard, and in this case the implementation is open source and it supports open standard. So those are two little bit different things. Really quick recap on the market share. So these are the latest Gartner numbers available. They published them in 2015. I would expect that the new update will be published anytime soon. And you could see IBM has #1 position in business process management, ESB, messaging, managed file transfer, transaction processing monitors, appliances, B2B, and as well as service governance. Now we're #2 in application servers behind Oracle, but Oracle reports their revenue for application server differently. When they sell Oracle applications and other products, they split part of that revenue because WebLogic is included in some of those products. They report some part of that revenue as WebLogic, so that helps them to boost WebLogic revenue. Where when we sell IBM products that include WebSphere App Server, we do not report any part of that revenue as an app server. But the good news is that you could see we're growing much faster than WebLogic. So you could see we grew 10% year to year, where WebLogic only grew 1.6%. And you could see Red Hat grew 36%, but that's on 2.6% market share, which is a very, very small market share. So it's really hard for Red Hat to maintain the investment into JBoss, because really when you look at who is contributing source code to JBoss, for the most part, it's really Red Hat company itself. And to keep the innovation, you really have to get the revenue from somewhere. And as you can see, because Gartner market share is based purely on revenue from support and licenses, you could see that Red Hat does not really get that much revenue for JBoss. And that's very unfortunate for them, and it makes it very hard to invest into the platform. Eventually, you either run out of money or you decide to change your course and abandon, or I don't know what's going to happen, but there is not that much revenue that flows in for JBoss. So it's going to be really hard for JBoss, Red Hat, to keep that up. And it shows in product releases. If you look at the speed of innovation of WebSphere compared to JBoss, you could see we've been moving much, much faster. Now, in terms of the overall application infrastructure platform, just taking a high-level view, like a heat map from 50,000 feet level, to build and run an application, it's not enough just to have an application server. So at the beginning of this presentation, I showed you that the application server competitive landscape is obviously very busy, and there are lots of alternatives, but app server itself is not enough. Just like operating system is not enough, you also need other things. So you potentially need API management, and you may need the JavaScript runtime, which IBM provides. You might need data caching for better performance for highly scalable websites. IBM provides that, as well as Oracle. Coherence is a very good product as well, where Red Hat and some other open source products are lagging behind that. You might want a quick deployment factor for your app server runtime, in which case IBM provides Pure App System, which is a 3-hour time to value. You open the box, plug it into the wall, in 3 hours you run your first application, and it's highly virtualized, has all of the management, all the storage, all the networking. You don't get with any of the IBM competitors, Oracle, Exalogic, a little bit similar, but not quite. Now you also need DevOps. For DevOps, IBM has Urban Code and Rational products, where IBM competitors to rely on third-party vendors. The cloud, we have both public cloud as well as on-prem platform as a service, as well as we provide hybrid capabilities. Oracle doesn't really have much just yet. They're working on that. Red Hat has OpenShift, which is a very good on-premise Red Hat offering, but it's not quite as strong in the public environment, and the hybrid cloud is quite weak. And there are some other open source options as well. And finally, you need IT service management, and those are things like performance monitoring, help desk operations, security checks, log analytics, and those kinds of things. IBM has a very strong Tivoli ITSM portfolio, where Oracle doesn't really have much to offer in that. Red Hat doesn't play in that space, and those vendors rely on third-party products and vendors to fill those gaps. Now, let's talk about the technical side first, and then we'll talk about pricing and costs and other things. WebSphere has had significant improvements over the last 15 years of its history. And if you look at the IBM investment, we've spent many billions of dollars on developing and enhancing WebSphere. And again, the revenue that we get from the product, we reinvest into the product itself, and it shows. So if you used WebSphere 7, 8, 10 years ago, it's not the same WebSphere anymore. It is quite different. We evolved the product quite a bit, and you can see that we have a big focus on usability, on performance, on security. I'm not going to go through all of these in a lot of details. You can download the presentation from the blog, ibmadvantage.com. In fact, you can see that in the right-hand side, and you can get this full PowerPoint version of this deck from SlideShare. We've introduced Liberty Profile, and the Liberty Profile is a refactoring of WebSphere application server. So what Liberty Profile is, we took components from WebSphere application server, servlet runtime, the JSP runtime, the web connectors and other things, and we refactored and moved them into the Liberty Profile and made it OSGI enabled. So we kept those components, but we changed the systems management infrastructure, the configuration and monitoring items, and we made WebSphere Liberty much more lightweight. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And you can see we're moving the most popular features from the traditional WebSphere product into Liberty first, and then we move maybe a little bit less popular features later. So we haven't moved every single feature from WebSphere traditional product into Liberty just yet. We're still working on that. You could see we introduced auto-scaling, dynamic routing, REST connectors, and many other things in 2014. Now, last year, about a year ago in 2015, we were the first vendor to ship production version of the Java EE7 product. Again, that was way before WebLogic, way before JBoss introduced EE7 compliant products. We were the first ones. And by the way, we did the same thing with Java EE6 as well. We were the first vendor to ship production version of the Java EE6 certified product. We introduced very powerful administration center in Liberty so that you can graphically manage and monitor Liberty, deploy instances, clusters, applications, as well as providing the command line tooling. We have Docker images and support, log collector analytics, a lot of beta items, and we kept improving in second half of 2015. You could see that from Liberty Admin Center you can manage Node.js and Docker right from that same console where you manage Liberty Profile, added Kerberos, WebRTC gateway, enhanced Liberty WebSphere Developer Toolkit, which is a Eclipse-based plugin for managing Liberty environments, added a lot of the management configuration security. In the first half of this year, we added API discovery. You can log into the console if you have security permissions, and with the Swagger UI, you could look at all of the REST APIs, and that integrates very well with IBM API Connect product, or you could use it standalone. That's a very powerful thing for microservices, for instance. And then we have other things, including, again, performance and security improvements in Liberty Profile. Now, overall positioning. So I've mentioned that we have the traditional WebSphere application server, and we've kept enhancing that since 1998. And if you look at this graph, on the horizontal axis, I have the scale. On the left-hand side, those are very small environments. On the right-hand side, large, big environments with hundreds of servers, maybe even thousands of servers. Now, on the vertical axis, I have programming model. At the very bottom, it's just JSP servlet programming model. In the middle, Java Enterprise Edition with all the JCA, JTA, messaging, and other things. And then on top, things that haven't made it yet into the Java EE. Things like SCA, SIP, OSGI, and Kerberos, and other things. So the traditional WebSphere has two products. We include Liberty and the traditional profile with all the WebSphere versions. So you could see Express, WebSphere Base, and WebSphere Network Deployment. You get two profiles in one product. You can install both or one of them, and it's up to you to decide. Any customer that has WebSphere license also has license of WebSphere Liberty Profile. So you can run that, again, on the same machine. You can install both and run them side by side if you'd like. Now we also have WebSphere Liberty Core, which has a more limited programming model than the full WebSphere Liberty Profile, and it's targeted for very small environments, and it's priced for small environments as well. Now, how does it compare to WebLogic, for instance? So WebLogic has 3 flavors: Standard, Enterprise, and WebLogic Suite, and it's targeted for mostly medium to large deployments, and it has a little bit more than the Java EE programming model. It has few extensions on top of that. Now, what about JBoss? JBoss can be run in very small environments because it's very lightweight, and it has mostly limited to Java EE programming model for the most part. The Tomcat itself, the vanilla Apache Tomcat, it's just JSP servlet runtime, and it runs in small to maybe medium environments. Now there is Tommy, which is Tomcat Enterprise Edition, that extends the Tomcat programming model, and it adds quite a few components, but not a full Java EE7 certified server. And then there is TC Server from Pivotal. It adds some management monitoring capabilities to Tomcat, so it can scale a little bit better, and the programming model is just a little bit more than Tomcat. So that's overall landscape. Again, this is a very high level picture. We're going to dive into a lot more details on this. To translate this in a feature function map, again, this is a heat map with the high level features, so you could see Liberty Profile was indeed traditional, Tomcat, TC Server, JBoss, and WebLogic. These are all latest versions as of today, and you could see that the Java EE7 support in Liberty is available. JBoss is supported in an open source version, which is Wildfly, not yet production support. WebLogic has been certified finally for Java EE7. Now you could see performance-wise, and then you could see this legend on the left-hand side. The green is excellent, going all the way down to white, which means no support at all, and anything in between, like yellow, being limited. So you could see performance, security, transaction management, the messaging engine, caching included. WebSphere Extreme Scale is bundled with all versions of WebSphere, so you can use that free of charge on the same hardware, or if you want, you can deploy on a different hardware, and in that case, you would have to license that separately. But if you deploy Extreme Scale on the same machine, you don't need to pay extra cost. The admin GUI, what I show here for Liberty, is still not quite as advanced as was in D admin GUI, but it is definitely very, very powerful, no less powerful than JBoss, for instance. Lots of troubleshooting tools, administrative scripting, the very simple migration from version to version. We'll talk about a lot of these. So the idea of my presentation, that this is a summary of the entire deck, and for every line in this table I have one or more pages of the technical proof points, if you will. Now, Liberty Profile, I'll mention that already. It's a very light runtime. If you download Java EE Web Profile features or Java EE Full Profile, it gets up to 94 gigabyte download because of all of the Java Enterprise Edition features. It starts very, very fast, only a few seconds. It has powerful admin console, integrated toolset. It's, again, free for development. Now, the installation of Liberty Profile is very, very simple and quick. I'll show you some numbers specifically on that later. The high-level map of features in Liberty Profile, you could see we have Liberty Core, and then WebSphere Liberty included with WAS Base, and then Liberty included with WAS ND, as well as Liberty on ZOS. So you could see the features that we've added, and we're adding them very, very quickly. So there are several features being added pretty much every month. And like I said, you can download the beta versions of the product to play with latest features. Now, the nice thing about Liberty Profile, you don't have to upgrade all of the features. You get zero migration, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think it's a very important one. Now, a lot of times I hear that I don't need a full application server. So remember that camp on the right-hand side on the first chart in my presentation, the Tomcat and Jetty. A lot of developers say, I don't need the application server. I can get the packages from open source. I can get CXF, Jersey, or other packages, and I can run them on Tomcat or Jetty. It's easy, and I can configure what I want. So that can work, but I think it's very difficult to pull off and make it effective. Because when you start an application, and if it's a hello world application, yeah, sure, it's easy to do Tomcat or JD, but then you might need web services or REST or security or logging, management, monitoring, and those things are missing in Tomcat and JD. So you very quickly end up building, designing your own application server. So it's really not that easy. And just look at these APIs. So what is application development? Application development is basically taking advantage of the stuff that's already out there, so you don't have to code as much, reuse as much as possible, stand on the shoulders of giants. In other words, use the APIs provided to you by the platform. And in this case, the APIs provided by various platforms are vastly different. Look at the APIs provided by Liberty or WebSphere Classic runtime, and look at the APIs not provided in Tomcat or JD. I don't show JD here, but it's pretty much the same as Tomcat. So you would see that you will have to find those things for Tomcat, and there are certainly dozens of open source projects that could fill these gaps, but you will be managing dependencies, security, logging, configuration, monitoring, management. All of that will be different for every single project. And not even that, so if you're using Hibernate for Tomcat and you're using Jersey for REST, Hibernate for JPA for perhaps, and then you might be using CXF for web services, and you might be using some other APIs. Now all of these things, and Spring Framework and so forth, they all do annotation scanning in your jar files when you deploy the app, and they don't know about each other. So configuration is different, monitoring is different, the logging settings are different, the jar file scanning happens repeatedly, and it takes much longer to start the Tomcat than it does Liberty, because in Liberty we do that once. We scan annotations once because we integrated. Same thing with JBoss. They implemented that optimization so they don't have to do repeated scanning. That's why applications deploy so fast. And Liberty, because we optimized that startup time, because we control the stack. Tomcat, that's up to developer, and the developer experience deteriorates very quickly the larger the application. So you could see all of these APIs, WebSocket and Batch and JMS that we provide in Liberty that you don't get with Tomcat. A while ago, about September last year, I wrote a blog article on websphere.com. In fact, if you go to the blog ibmadvantage.com, used to be called websphere.com, you could see, you can type developer point of view, and you could see this article on the blog, and you can download the scripts that I used. So here's the article, Lightweight Java App Servers Update, and you could see the servers that I compared, and you could see the configuration. I used the tests on this very same laptop, and you could see the demo, how I ran it, and you can download all of the scripts. So you could see scripts that I used to run the environment. I put them on GitHub, so you can run that yourself. So all of these tests were, most of these tests, not all, were automated. And when you see the start and stop times, the deployment times, the memory usage, you could see that Liberty is ahead of every single other competitor. It has faster startup time, it uses less memory, it spends less time doing application redeployment, the download size is the smallest, the time to install and configure is the smallest, number of configuration files is only one, updates are very dynamic. So for instance, in Liberty, when you make an update in configuration file, you don't even have to restart the JVM. You could even change the HTTP port number and it will be picked up on the fly. With Tomcat or WebLogic or JBoss, you'd have to recycle the JVM. And that's a problem for developers as well as in production, because in production you may want to put the new configuration files, and maybe you don't want to bounce the servers if you don't have to. So in Liberty, that is very powerful. You do have to bounce Liberty if you update some core Liberty files, for instance, the app server itself. In that case, you do have to bounce it. We provide the development environment, which is free plugins we have for Eclipse and IntelliJ IDEA has, and you can even use NetBeans for Liberty development if you want, but I would recommend WebSphere Developer Toolkit, WDT. We integrate with all of the DevOps tools. We have Java EE7 support, unlike some of our competitors. You get free development license, which is unlimited for Liberty, and if you have production licenses, you even get free support for your development licenses. So you could see how this compares against Glassfish, Jetty, and Tomcat and JBoss. So that's a resource and the URL at the very bottom of this page. I mentioned zero migration by design several times, and it's a very key architectural decision that we've made when we built Liberty Runtime by moving those components from the WAS traditional profile. The trouble is that when you redeploy your application into a latest version of the application server, you may have to do a lot of testing because the specs and implementation in the app server changes. In Liberty, you don't have to redeploy the app server if your app hasn't been upgraded to the latest version of the spec. So for instance, Servlet 3.1 or 3.0, we allow you to configure older version of the spec on the latest version of the runtime. So it's a lot more than just backwards compatibility. We actually allow you to use the features, even new features could be added into existing server. So on one hand, you don't have to upgrade all of the server. On another hand, you don't have to give up or migrate applications by force. You can take advantage of the latest server runtime, but run old features on that server. In that case, you get latest JDK, latest performance, latest security, management, monitoring features, but the spec level could be backwards. So that's very powerful, and that was by design, and this is unlike any other application server on the market. OSGI is very important. We do provide developer support for OSGI in Liberty Runtime. Performance is a huge focus area for IBM, and as you can see, over last several years, we've improved performance dramatically. So if you have certain number of transactions running, let's say you have one transaction running on a core, 4 years later, for the same application, you could run probably 7.5 times more transactions. So on that same core, well, in this case, on one core, you could run 7.4 times more transactions. Now, on this graph, we used the SpecJ Enterprise 2010 to do the benchmark test. Now, there are three things that have changed in this graph, left to right, other than time. So I guess four things, including time. So left to right, what you have changed is time has passed. You get new version of WebSphere, which becomes faster, and it uses more recent version of JDK, which also becomes faster, and it uses more recent version of hardware, which also becomes faster. So you get hardware, JDK, and WebSphere on time, and because of that, you get 7.4 times performance improvement per core for the same application. So that means if you need to deploy more workload, perhaps your business is growing, you don't have to buy new hardware or more hardware of the same old hardware or buy more WebSphere licenses. All you need to do, you just take that app, you update the WebSphere version and possibly refresh the hardware, repurpose the old hardware and use the number of cores, fewer number of cores, and you can remove up to 7.5 times number of cores for hardware and software to handle the same workload. Or if you're growing, you can handle and accommodate more workload by upgrading hardware and WebSphere. So that's very important. Now, how about comparing that performance to WebLogic, for instance? The SpecJ App Server 2010 is industry benchmark developed by multiple vendors collaborating together. And I have two tables on this page. One is the actual performance index per core. And the older numbers on the bottom and on the right, the more recent numbers are in the left-hand corner. And you can see that these are the most recent ones. And this is the relative index of performance per core for WebSphere compared to WebLogic. The blue meaning more than 1, meaning WebSphere is faster. The red is less than 1, meaning WebSphere is slower. So you could see some of the really old 2012 performance numbers from IBM are slower than the very new 2014 numbers from Oracle. But all of the latest numbers are much, much faster. So that means with WebSphere, you can run up to 2 times more transactions per core compared to WebLogic. Now that's interesting, but not necessarily that useful. What's really powerful is the dollar per transaction. That's where you take into consideration the cost of the software, app server, database, and the cost of the hardware, including networking and storage. And the table on the bottom compares dollar per transaction. And again, the numbers in blue where IBM is better. In this case, 62% cheaper per transaction, 90% cheaper per transaction. So you could see that when you take into consideration performance and cost of hardware, software, networking, and storage, WebSphere is much more efficient than WebLogic. Now, these are examples from the spec.org website where you could see Oracle configuration and cost per single transaction and IBM configuration and cost per single transaction, as well as number of cores needed, number of transactions per core. So to summarize, in terms of performance, you could see that on Intel hardware, results published in February 2015, roughly about a year ago, IBM was quite a bit faster on identical hardware compared to Oracle. Now, running on Power compared to Spark, we were pretty much twice as fast. Older configuration, we were more than 2 times faster, and then even older results on identical hardware on Intel this time, we were roughly 20% faster than WebLogic. Now, what about JBoss and Wildfly? Well, we can't use SpecJ app server because JBoss never published these results for some reason. They probably cannot even run the benchmark at all, or if they can, then they don't get good results. So whatever, we can speculate all day long. The advantage of WebSphere in the SpecJ result is infinite because comparing to 0, well, it's not even legal comparing to 0. Now, we have compared JBoss performance on other benchmark applications, including DayTrader, for instance. So DayTrader runs about 70% faster on WebSphere. Now, we also compared DayTrader, well, in this case, by the way, we used the DayTrader 7, and because JBoss is not Java EE 7 certified, we had to use Wildfly for comparison. In this case, in a Docker environment, we were 2.5 times faster than Wildfly. Now, DayTrader 3 is Java EE 6 application, and we were 30% faster than JBoss EAP in that case. And then TradeLite, which is just JSP servlet application, it was a little bit faster on WebSphere compared to the Wildfly application. Now, what about Tomcat? Again, Tomcat is not full Java EE 7 certified runtime, so we can't run SpecJ app server numbers, but we can run TradeLite on Tomcat, and we did, and we ran it on Docker, so you could see with one Docker container, we were almost 4 times faster than Tomcat. On 2 Docker containers, again, almost 4 times faster. On 4 Docker containers, 3.5 times faster than Tomcat, using a TradeLite workload. On a native OS, using a TradeLite, we were 30% faster. So these are the Tomcat performance numbers. Now, global transactions are really important. You don't need them for every application, but I would guess anywhere from 5 to maybe 15% of applications need global two-phase commit XA type of transactions. And JBoss, WebLogic, WebSphere, Liberty, they all provide XA transaction support, where JD and Tomcat do not. So when you need it, it could be indispensable. It's a very powerful tool. It's a heavy tool, but it could be extremely useful, both in terms of the consistency of data as well as developer productivity. And in terms of recovery, Liberty and WasND provide, especially WasND full profile, provides very powerful and very quick recovery of distributed transactions across multiple machines in a peered clustered environment, something that Even Liberty does not provide today, and JBoss or WebLogic, they do not provide that kind of very quick recovery capability for transactional log. Now, transactions are important, obviously, and there could be many reasons why transactions might fail. It could be hardware error, it could be software error, it could be human error, and if you rely on Tomcat or Jetty to process your business critical data, just be aware that you have to be careful with how you manage those errors and how do you do the recovery, because in some cases you can repeat transactions and calls and service calls, but in other cases they're not repeatable. So you don't want to lose the money, nor do you want to duplicate money in multiple different accounts. With JBoss, there are some high availability issues. So when we tested JBoss with certain cluster configurations, we found that, for instance, transaction log requires manual recovery. And in some cases, the deployment of an application causes an interruption. In WebSphere, you can have multiple versions of the application deployed. We'll talk about the application edition management later. In JBoss, you will have some interruption time. John, which is JBoss Operations Network, it uses database, and you have to make that highly available. And then you also have to restart JBoss JVMs after you make about half of the different configuration changes require server restart. Where in Liberty, the configuration changes, 99% of them are all dynamic, do not require JVM restart, which is, again, it's not only good for developers, but also very good for operations, for running stuff in production. So it's very powerful. That's not to say JBoss does not have high availability, it certainly does, but it's just not as advanced as Liberty Profile or WebSphere ND Full Profile. Now, just to give you a quick example of the Liberty Admin Center, we've developed this Admin Center a couple of years ago, and we have been enhancing that very quickly. You can monitor clusters, applications, servers, nodes. You can deploy, you can search, you can filter, you can tag items, you can edit server configuration right through the tool. You can monitor server performance, the JVM performance, the CPU. You can allow and configure automatic scaling. In fact, right here I have a link for the demo. If you want to go to the YouTube channel for IBMadvantage.com, there's a demo that shows how the auto scaling works in Liberty as well as WebSphere Full Profile. So Tomcat does not have any admin console at all other than just a very basic HTML page. JBoss admin console is very difficult to use. John, especially John, is very convoluted, and it seems like John will be discontinued by JBoss in favor of the new admin console. You could see some more details on Liberty Admin Console. You get the status of servers, you get alerts, you get notifications. You can stop and start servers from the console as well as manage them and configure these servers. So like I said, we've spent a lot of time enhancing the console. You can deploy JVMs and even Docker containers through the console. So there are a lot of improvements. One of the items that is still in beta is log analytics, where you can run and collect multiple logs, including the ones running in the cloud, and you can connect it into the Bluemix log analytics services, or you can use the Apache Log Analytics Elasticsearch. Liberty Collective is the new way that we do clustering in Liberty. I'm not going to go through a lot of details. You can find that in documentation, but the idea is to combine servers in auto-scale groups so that those collective can be managed as a single entity. Obviously, Jetty and Tomcat do not have that notion, so you would have to manage those servers individually, or build your own scripting framework, which is very labor intensive, and it's not easy to do with Tomcat and Jetty, building that kind of stuff from scratch. Where in Liberty, collectives are easily done, very simple configuration in server.xml. All you do on the server, you include collective controller, and on managed members, you include collective member and cluster member, and any Liberty instance can become part of the collective, including Liberty Core. So Liberty Core can be run as part of the collective. So what that means is you will just need one license of Liberty, part of WASND, to be collective controller, and then from that one collective controller, or you can have more than one, you can manage multiple Liberty Core instances in the collective from a single point of administration. Now, if you want those instances to become part of the cluster with all of the auto-scaling up and down, then they would have to be converted into WAS-ND Liberty ND licenses. But if all you want is just manage them and do basic HTTP round robin or random from HTTP server, you could perfectly use one Liberty controller and multiple Liberty Core instances. The admin hierarchy of privileges in WAS traditional is very powerful, and you could see that we separate the roles of administrators in deployer, operator, monitor. This is something that's not really available in JBoss or Wildfly or Tomcat or JD. So again, for security reasons, this could be very powerful. Liberty does not support that today either. Now, it might become available in the future. The admin security allows you to restrict who can manage what parts of the WAS-ND full profile. So you can say that certain administrators can manage certain servers and certain applications and resources, but not other resources. So if you have a large cell of WAS-ND full profile, you can have multiple administrators, not just with different roles, but also with different access control lists for different resources. That's something that you don't have with JBoss or Tomcat or JD. So a quick summary of security, comparing WAS, Liberty, WebLogic, JBoss, and Tomcat. So you could see they all support basic web application security. Tomcat does not support Java EE security standards. The admin roles, again, I mentioned that just a minute ago, not supported in JBoss or Tomcat, nor are they supported in Liberty. Same thing with resource security. The audit of administration changes is supported in WebLogic and WebSphere, but not yet in Liberty, and very limited support in JBoss. LDAP is relatively well supported. We even have federated LDAP in WAS and Liberty, which you don't get in JBoss or Tomcat as well. That's listed right here. We have Spinago support in Liberty and WAS, and Oracle, WebLogic, and JBoss support that as well. Then you can see we have Kerberos support. Actually, we do have Kerberos support in Liberty now, so I need to update the chart. OAuth and SAML, OpenID Connect, so you could see what we support in Liberty and WAS, and you could see what's missing, keys and certificate management and other things. So you could see you get a very comprehensive security support in Liberty. Now, if you need to run Tomcat in a secure environment, that's one of the major disadvantages of Tomcat. The security there is not very advanced. So you can make it work, but that will take a lot of labor and a lot of third-party packages, a lot of testing, a lot of validation. It's really not that easy. So you're going to be spending a lot of time, and then later with updates, your security packages have their own release cycles. Tomcat has their own release cycles. JVM has its own release cycle. So managing, configuring, testing, validating, patching becomes very difficult. You might spend quite a lot of time doing all of that work. And somewhat similar with JBoss as well. Another area that is very interesting is intelligent management. Intelligent management in WebSphere, we split that into 4 parts. One is application edition management, then server health management, the SLA dynamic clustering, intelligent routing, and prioritizing of requests. Now, all of these things are designed to make your administration less difficult, to save you labor on admin hours and simplify administration to make your server more resilient and more reliable. So you could see that with intelligent management, we've done a lot of work with customers trying to estimate the business impact of the intelligent management features. So you could see that our customers were able to save up to 45% on hardware. So how do you save on hardware with intelligent management? Well, in the past, you had to run multiple individual servers for different applications, different lines of businesses, because you don't want one application to overtake the other application resources. So lines of businesses sometimes would even have completely separate hardware or separate virtual machines, which creates virtual machine sprawl, and you have a lot of dependencies, you have a lot of memory usage, a lot of memory and CPU overcommit. With intelligent management, you can deploy in a much more dense environment. You can have a smaller pool of hardware, on average 45% less, but you can deploy the same applications and have the same performance. Now, with intelligent management, you can consolidate that workload and you could have fewer servers running more applications because you can guarantee that their response times and resources will not be wasted on a rogue application or the one that just consumes all of the resources. So you can have that separation of resources between apps, and that saves on hardware as well as software, because if you have less hardware, you have to have less software licenses. Administration becomes simpler as well because you configure those policies and the server will enforce the policies for you. You don't have to sit and watch all day what's going on with your server, as well as outages. So there are certain preventative actions like server health management that allow you to avoid outages or make them shorter or make troubleshooting easier. So these are the things available in Liberty and WAS full profile as well. So to give you an example of service policies in WAS full profile, so you could see that you can define different service policies, gold, silver, with different response times, 1 second, 15 seconds, half a second. And then when you get the requests into the application server, those requests will be prioritized not only according to their importance, but also according to the workload on the server, so that you can have multiple URLs within the same application being served and prioritized differently, not to mention that multiple applications will have relative priorities as well. So this is very powerful. You can set it up through the admin console or scripting, and this is available in WebSphere was indeed traditional profile. Hopefully it will come into the Liberty profile at some point. So intelligent routing, that's a component that allows you to do those routing decisions, make those decisions. And you could see that we have a lot of advanced functionality built into that intelligent routing capability, which you can run as a standalone Java-based on-demand router, basically a proxy. Or as of a couple of years ago, you can also run that intelligent routing inside of the HTTP server plugin. And that intelligent routing in WebSphere can do a lot of things that you wouldn't find with, for instance, Tomcat or JBoss. So you could see a lot of nodes. So for instance, with intelligent routing, you can configure CPU and overload protection. You could route across multiple third-party servers, not just WebSphere Liberty servers. You can do traffic shaping and SLA enforcement, for instance. Again, if your response time for application A becomes longer, but it needs to be faster, we're going to slow down the requests for other less important applications because we want to serve and prioritize and dispatch more important requests first. We support application edition aware routing. We can grow and shrink clusters, and we can route to new servers dynamically without you having to do anything. We support health policies in that routing. We'll automatically adjust the weight of the server depending on the workload on that server, depending on the CPU usage, response times. We can limit number of connections, and we have an option, so you could see right here the third column, intelligent routing built into the IBM Data Power appliance. It's called application optimization, and you can see with the application optimization there are a lot of really interesting things that we can do because it's a hardware-based appliance with firmware-based updates. So we can do content-based routing, we can protect against XML, SQL injection attacks, we can do XML processing, encryption, decryption, validation, and rate limiting, and a lot of very powerful things, including writing custom advisors. So these are really powerful options that you wouldn't find with WebLogic, with JBoss EAP. Now there are some of these options available with what Oracle calls Traffic Director, but unfortunately for Oracle and their customers, that only works on XLogic, and that has very limited appeal and very limited use in real world. Dynamic clustering is another very advanced feature. So what that does, it allows you to automatically increase or decrease the number of instances in your environment for a particular application. So what we can do with Liberty as well as WAS full profile, we can observe your SLA levels, and according to your request SLA levels, we will grow or shrink the sizes of the cluster. Again, I did show you the link to the video, to the demo that I recorded for both the WAS full profile as well as Liberty profile, how to set up and run and test dynamic clustering. Lazy application start, that's another interesting feature in WAS in the full profile, where you can stop all of the JVMs for the app and you can start them when you actually have the requests coming in for that application. And you can configure a number of instances. You could see some details here on the chart. It's a very interesting feature. Overload protection is another interesting one, where you could say, well, I want to keep my applications healthy. Now this one works with full profile of WebSphere, not yet with Liberty at this point. And you can say, well, I don't want my CPU on the server to go above 90, maybe 95%. The reason is, if your CPU goes to 100%, your server is going to start missing some of the administrative commands for configuration, deployment, maybe even heartbeats. And if it misses several heartbeats, then the plugin that does workload management might decide to exclude it from workload management for a certain period of time, which only makes it worse, because then it's going to load the other servers with this extra request traffic. So the overload protection could really help, and none of our competitors provide that capability. I mentioned that Liberty has auto-scaling, and it's very simple to set up. So you could see a snippet of configuration where you can define the scaling policy. And the scaling policy in Liberty is not quite the same as it is in WAS full profile. In full profile, there are more options for scaling policy, but we're working on that and moving some of those features into Liberty. In Liberty, you can define scaling policy based on memory, on CPU, and a couple of other options. So you could see the dynamic clustering in WebSphere full profile, as well as Liberty and WebLogic and JBoss. Static provisioning of clusters is easy. Everybody can do it. Even Tomcat can do it. You can install JVMs, configure the HTTP server plugin, and have your static cluster running. But the changes in a cluster configuration are not as easy with Tomcat. So if you want to change number of Tomcat servers, you're going to have to go and update the HTTP server plugin. Now with JBoss, they fixed that, and you don't have to do manual updates. Depending on what, like if you use mod cluster with JBoss, you don't have to update the plugin by hand. But now it gets more interesting when we automatically stop and start servers. That's where JBoss and Tomcat do not provide those functions, where we can even provision entire new servers to handle the new workload. So in Liberty, you can predefine server ahead of time, and you can install and configure, but let Liberty stop and start. Or you can go further than that. You can even install new servers dynamically based on the workload, as long as you have SSH credentials to the host. So obviously the operating system has to be running and the host needs to be up, and you have to provide SSH. And then when we have to scale up the cluster, we will push the JVM, the Liberty, the app, the configuration, install all of that, make it part of the cluster, and add it to dynamic cluster. And we can do the same with Docker containers as well. And the scaling policy could be based on memory, heap, CPU, and more in the future. And for instance, in WAS full profile, you could see that we can do response time, URL, and other things. And we can do quite a few other things advanced in full profile that we don't yet support in Liberty. And you could read my blog article on the bottom. You could see the URL to the blog, websphere.com. Now we renamed that into ibmadvantage.com blog. All right. Now I have more details. You can read that more in the blog on differences between dynamic clustering in JBoss and WebSphere. So for now, I'll skip that because, again, you can find that in my blog article. What about the cloud? How can we scale dynamically in the cloud? So with IBM Bluemix, there are a lot of scaling metrics, very similar to what we do on-prem with the intelligent management features, but implemented in Bluemix environment for Liberty. And you can get some of those things with Red Hat OpenShift, but they're very, very limited. For instance, the scaling metric in OpenShift is only based on number of connections, unless you're using on-prem OpenShift Enterprise, in which case there are more options. But a OpenShift Online, which is a public hosted offering, you can only do that on number of connections until they deploy OpenShift version 3. In Bluemix, you can do scalability, auto-scaling based on JVM heap, memory usage, throughput, or response time. We don't do number of connections. And then you can also define the windows when to start doing making those changes, like what's the bridge duration, the windows and instance count going up and down by how many instances, minimum and maximum. So that's very different, much more advanced than OpenShift. Oracle, well, Oracle doesn't do that, and they plan on doing that, and they claim that they can handle that in the cloud. Unfortunately, it does not work. Go try it. In WASD full profile, we have something that we call command assistance. So whenever you do something in the admin console, all of those things can be recorded and written down as a Jython WSAdmin scripts, so that you do that once through the console, and then later you can rerun the script as a repeatable, manageable environment to automate it and reduce the labor you spend on management. One interesting feature we have in WASD that works with Liberty as well as full profile is what we call the job manager. The job manager allows you to manage many different cells or collectives from a same administration point, or you could have multiple job managers. And the benefit of a job manager that the things can be scheduled in advance, and you can do those management tasks remotely. So you could see the admin console, how you can create clusters, members, you can schedule filters, you can define to which servers and JVMs and applications that command needs to apply based on a wildcard or substitution rules and version of WebSphere, the host name, and a number of other parameters. It's very, very flexible. You can script it or you can use it through the GUI. I'm showing the GUI as an example, as well as you can schedule those administrative commands. So this is something that's not available with a lot of our competitive products. And you can see that you can monitor the execution of these tasks. You can schedule these jobs, you can make them recurring. So on this, you could say, I want to run it every week, for instance. I want to run it at specified time. And I can also monitor, I can suspend, resume, and stop and delete my jobs. And I can see on the right-hand side the status summary. For this job, how many servers it completed, in progress, failed, incompleted, and so forth. So that's very, very advanced capability that you could use as part of WASD. And you can manage standalone servers, not just WASD servers, with this capability. Where if you look at the JBoss operations network, what they call JON, it's very confusing, extremely difficult to use, non-reliable, and I find that really most customers of JBoss, Red Hat, they're really not using JON. And if they are using, they're not using it for management, they're using it for monitoring at best. And even that is very, very difficult because the console is confusing, it uses database for configuration, and it takes a rocket scientist to configure and run this environment and understand that. Now in TC Server and Tomcat, for the most part, administration is done at the XML configuration file level, where in WebSphere you have a nice user interface. If you don't want to use XML, you don't have to. Obviously, in a DevOps automated environments, you do want to use XML because you script the configuration, and that is very well done in Liberty and Tomcat as well. You can script a lot of things, albeit in Liberty scripting is easier compared to Tomcat. But you also get the option of using the admin console in both Liberty and WebSphere, which you don't really get that option in Tomcat. So the administration in JBoss is mostly manual. including scripting using third-party tools and packages. And customers normally avoid JBoss Operations Network, and they build either their own management tools or they rely on third-party. Application Edition Management is a very useful feature. It's part of IBM Intelligent Management, which is a feature of WAS-ND. For now, it only works with WAS full profile. And there are a number of different options how you can deploy applications. And you could see there are validation modes and rollout policies. And you can have multiple applications deployed. And if your application version 3 does not work, with a click of a button, you can quickly revert back to version 2 because it never really got uninstalled. It is still kept in repository, so it's very easy to move from active application to inactive application. So you can see the states, and you can keep them all, and you can cancel the validation mode if you want. And the nice thing, you can run application in the validation mode. What that means is you don't have to deploy application right away. You can still have your version 3 of application running, like you can see on this screen. Version 3 is active and is serving user requests. And if with Tomcat or JBoss or WebLogic, you would have to create a separate environment, probably a mirror hardware infrastructure or VMs that are completely separate and standalone. In WebSphere, you can use the same cell. You don't have to provision mirror hardware environment, meaning you double the hardware and software license footprint. In this case, in WebSphere, you can avoid that duplication. That's a lot of cost savings and a lot of administration savings as well, because you run an application 4.0 in a validation mode, and only your sysadmins or QA team can access that version. Once you validate it on this very same environment, you click and you activate and you roll it out. And all of the previous versions become inactive, and then you can revert back. With JBoss, you will have to undeploy, redeploy. You have a disruption in your service for the users, and you have a lot of manual labor. It makes it to spend more hardware, software, and labor and the disruption, unless you write a lot of automation and scripting to have two parallel hardware instances running, so you do non-disruptive failover to the new instance, in which case you avoid the downtime, but means you avoid the downtime by having more hardware and software and doing all of that scripting where it's all out of the box with WebSphere. That's very powerful. So you could see a summary of the application deployment. Now, the nice thing is in Liberty, you can do uninterrupted application deployment, but only one application version. You can't have more application versions in Liberty or Tomcat or JBoss, as a matter of fact. Where in Oracle WebLogic and WebSphere, you can have more than one version, but in WebSphere you have more options. We keep those versions in repository. You can revert back. You can do atomic updates, and you can do activation of the old version, something that you cannot do in WebLogic. And you can even run application in a validation mode for a week, for a month if you want, which is something that you cannot do with other servers. So you could see the benefits. Again, the idea here is reduction of the hardware and software footprint and simplification of the admin labor, which is overall reducing the cost. Now, the other important part of intelligent management is health management. Health management can be run completely automatic or in manual mode, and it's supported in both full profile and Liberty profile as well. You can set health policies, conditions, actions, and triggers, and you can do corrective actions as well. So with health conditions, you could see that there are multiple different conditions. So for instance, we give you some predefined conditions out of the box, and you can also define custom health conditions based on PMI metrics or GEMX MBeans. So that basically gives you hundreds of different choices on how to trigger health actions and what to use as a health condition. So you could see age-based conditions, a storm drain, meaning the backend resource is not responding, total number of request condition, memory usage, request timeouts, and You can even use this little tool in WebSphere full profile where you can define that through the graphical user interface, the health configuration for the health actions. Now the health actions you can create using the admin console, and you can have a series of health actions in sequence. So you can, for instance, once the trigger is initiated for the health condition, the health action takes place. And the health action could be automatic or manual, and you can put them in sequence. You can reuse the health actions, you can resequence them, and you could, for instance, do the JVM heap dump, thread dumps. You can put server in maintenance mode. You can collect logs from the server, restart, put it out of the maintenance mode. So let's take an example. So let's say you have an application running and something happens over the weekend. You come on Monday and you see lots of exceptions in the log file. You don't know what happened over the weekend with your server, and it went down, and you maybe even get called into the data center with your pager or cell phone. Not good. You don't want to do that. What happens with health actions, what you can do, you can configure so that when something is triggered, like excessive memory usage or Java out of memory errors or excessive request timeouts, you can configure the health actions so the server is put into maintenance mode. You make a copy of the log files, you make JVM dump and the thread dump, you put it in a safe place, then you restart the server, put it back in service. Users are happy. You didn't have to go to the data center to do it yourself. You come on Monday, you have all of that diagnostic data to do the troubleshooting. With JBoss and Tomcat, all of that data will be long gone. Other than log files, you will still have the log files, but not the heap dumps, unless you build the custom monitoring for JBoss and Tomcat yourself. So this is provided out of the box with WebSphere and Liberty, in both full profile and Liberty profile. So again, the idea is that you detect, then report, prevent, and recover. So that's a vicious cycle in the Liberty profile, and this works for memory leak detection, slow threads, or hung threads. So that's done automatically in WAS, Traditional, and Liberty. So a lot of that diagnostic work can be done. In Liberty, we also have request timing feature where in the log file, so first of all, you don't have to recycle the server. You can define that on the fly. Again, Liberty is very dynamic. You don't have to stop and start when you change that. That's very powerful. And you can define the configuration for the request timing in the log file. You could say, well, threshold is 10 seconds, hung request threshold maybe 600 seconds, and then I want to include the request context information. And what is the sample rate? Oh, maybe sample rate is 1 or 10. And then you will see that data in the log file. You don't have that with JBoss or Tomcat. This is very, very powerful. You don't have to use a profiler and connect with a profiler. You can get this data through the log files for offline, after the fact troubleshooting, where with JBoss and Tomcat, you're going to have to rush into the data center and connect with the profiler and figure out what's going on. Again, this makes your life as an admin much easier. Same thing with event logging. You can configure event logging, and depending on the kinds of things, you can configure what kind of server requests, JDBC requests, and what are they, so you can troubleshoot and debug through the log files very easily. You don't have to put the system out print line statements in the source code like you would do in Tomcat or JBoss, or use the logging log4j statements. That would be automatically done by simply tapping into the internal logging feature of Liberty. So even if you forgot to put log4j in that particular place in your source code in Java, you can still intercept and log those requests to JDBC, HTTP servlets, and others using the Liberty facilities. So you don't have to change the source code, recompile, redeploy, and leverage that log4j statement that you just wrote. We have very powerful troubleshooting tools that we include with WebSphere Application Server. One of them is IBM Garbage Collection and Memory Visualizer. So it does all kinds of powerful things like memory leak detection, the optimizing the garbage collection. You can compare different garbage collection policies to each other. You can fine-tune the heap sizes. I have few snapshots, and this is a free tool. If you're a Tomcat or JBoss customer, you don't have that kind of tool. With WebSphere, Liberty, and Full Profile, you can download it. So what this is, you could see on the left-hand side, I have several tools as part of IBM Electronic Support Assistant, and you could see that you can monitor garbage collection summary. You could see the collections, and you can compare two different garbage collection policies. So for instance, I ran the same application several times through a certain workload, and here what I have is two different garbage collection policies compared side by side, so I can decide which policy is best for my application. And I can have some key statistics here, very easy access. I'm not really expert on garbage collection, to be honest with you, but this tool makes it very, very easy to decide which policy is the right one for you, because it gives you all of that information. And it also gives you tuning recommendations. So you can read the tuning recommendations, and it says in this case, the garbage collection seems to be taking a long time because of your large sizes specified, and compaction occurred in 60% of the collections. And it says, well, what do you want to do? Well, the recommendation is that you perhaps change certain settings, change the memory size or number of threads and so forth. So this is very powerful for somebody like me who is not experienced sysadmin, to have that kind of feedback right out of the box. The Performance Tuning Toolkit is also part of the IBM Electronic Support Assistant. It can help you connect and troubleshoot live JVMs, and it brings all the different performance tuning points into one place in WebSphere. It has very powerful capabilities. It has very powerful visualization and analytical capabilities. You can run it in Eclipse or in the browser, and as you can see, it gives you a lot of statistics. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. So on my blog, you can find this article about the Performance Tuning Toolkit, as well as a demo. And I recorded a YouTube video, actually a couple of them, where you could see these tools in action. So these are very, very powerful tools. The diagnostic tools for Java allows you to look at the Java application, as well as analyze the recorded in-flight data, so that you can do the analysis and troubleshooting offline after the fact. So it can trigger the dumps, and then it can analyze those dumps. So remember when I talked about the health actions, so one of the health actions could be the dump of the Java application state, and then you can analyze it after the fact. And that's where the diagnostic tool for Java can help you do that kind of analysis. So you could see it shows you all kinds of data and statistics, and again you could see that video on my blog. To summarize all that, the problem determination, troubleshooting, tooling, because we provide that IBM Electronic Support Assistant with all of those tools packaged with it, so you can use it with Liberty or WebSphere Full Profile. You could see that with Tomcat you don't have that. You can buy a third-party tool, or Oracle JVM, JDK provides some pretty good tools. Some of them could be used with Tomcat. Where with IBM, you could see we have all of these analyzers and troubleshooting tools, the guides, the garbage collection analyzer, and so forth, all included with WebSphere. The reasons I have question marks for JBoss, I haven't tried those tools with JBoss, so I'm sure Oracle JDK tools could be used for some of that work. I'm not sure how well they will work with JBoss though. Liberty Beta has a lot of new capabilities, WebRTC, Java Batch++, and with all of the extra things for Java Batch, and analytics for log analysis and intelligent management that we're adding some of the features in beta on top of the existing features. Documentation is a really important thing. Now, one of the very powerful features that you get with WebSphere is not the product, it's documentation. It's very detailed, it's always up to date. That documentation really helps you get started. Where with JBoss and Tomcat, their best documentation is their source code. So you don't get the source code with WebSphere Liberty, but the docs are much more accessible to the average user. Where with JBoss, documentation is quite often out of date. It's gotten a little bit better in the recent couple of years, but it's still nowhere near the quality of the WebSphere documentation. And Tomcat documentation really describes most frequently used parts of the product, but some of the less obvious parts that are more critical are not really that well documented. One other thing about JBoss is the history of messaging that's included with JBoss has been very, very disruptive. Back in 2002, they had JBoss MQ, then they changed it and rewrote JBoss messaging, then they replaced that with Hornet Q, now they replaced that with ActiveMQ, and now ActiveMQ is being replaced by this new combination of the Apache Cupid and ActiveMQ and Hornet Q into one product, and there will be no migration path like there wasn't one in the past for all of the previous messaging engines in JBoss. Where with Liberty or WebSphere Full Profile, you can use the embedded messaging, or you could use IBM MQ if you prefer, or you could use any third-party messaging. Platform support is quite important. WebSphere provides the most robust platform support if you look at the hardware platforms. So on the left-hand side, Intel, RISC, and Z series. And then we support the most diverse number of operating systems compared to any of our competitors. So we support the most versions and the most flavors of operating systems. You could see that WebLogic has pretty reasonable support, but not quite as many versions as we do. JBoss has very limited support. Tomcat, it's Apache Tomcat, obviously doesn't claim any support. They claim to run anywhere, but it's up to you to validate. Where TC Server only runs on Intel, they make no statements, Pivotal makes no statements on RISC or mainframe. JBoss does not make any support statements on mainframe, and they have very limited support on RISC platforms. So for instance, you could see they run on Spark and HP, but there is no support on AIX. They do support Red Hat on Power, although. Liberty on ZOS has some advanced native capabilities that make it faster, more reliable, and more secure. In terms of the database support, again, WebSphere is more advanced compared to WebLogic. We have more support for different databases and more versions of those databases. So by now we went through all of the technical feature function discussions, and I know it was a long one. Kudos to you if you stuck around up until this point. It's been a long discussion. Hopefully by this time you are convinced that Liberty and WebSphere Full Profile are very powerful and you want to give it a try. We make it easy for you. We created a migration toolkit. The migration toolkit allows you to move applications from multiple different servers into Liberty. Original sources of migration could be moving from WebLogic, Tomcat, JBoss, WAS, old version of WAS like WAS 6, 7, 8.0 into more recent versions of WAS, and even Oracle containers for Java. You take that through Migration Toolkit, and then you can move into Liberty or WebSphere Full Profile. And we can move both your application source code as well as your application configuration. And if you don't have the source code, we have a binary migration toolkit that will analyze the app and do a binary migration. Preferably, you want to do the source code migration. Now, the other thing that we do, we have a migration assessment offering, which is free. Again, if you go to the blog, and on the blog, you click on migration right here, you have several articles describing IBM migration offerings. We have free migration assessment tool, which is a web-based browser tool where we ask you a few questions about your servers and applications, and we'll generate a high-level estimate how hard it will be to migrate. As well as we have the Eclipse-based free migration plugin that can actually do the migration work for you. And we have the skills and set of red books and white papers, as well as a team that is highly skilled in migrations that can help you move the applications from those competitive products to Liberty Profile, either on-prem or in the cloud. The Eclipse migration plugin looks something like this. You can download it from Eclipse. Just download any version of Eclipse, go into Help, Marketplace, and search for WebSphere migration. And then you will see that there are multiple different rule sets for different products, and it will show you, it will change the source code in some cases, and if it cannot change the source code, it will generate a to-do item so that you can change that yourself, and it will tell you what to do. We can also estimate the migration targets. We will analyze all the APIs that your application is using, and we will tell you where can you run that application based on those APIs being used. So here's a more detailed view, what versions we support. This is always changing. This may not even be 100% accurate by now because we're updating migration toolkit constantly. So we actually might support more recent versions than this. And this is an example of this migration discovery tool with the direct URL to the tool that you could use. All right, so you made it this far. Let's talk about the financial considerations. Those of you who are more on the technical side may not be very interested in this, but cost is important. Money is important. Business is all about money. Everybody wants to save money, and one of the biggest reasons why people consider open source is because it is perceived to be free. Now, when you have an app or multiple apps with IBM, you have different deployment choices. You could deploy it into WAS-ND environment, you can deploy into WAS-base environment, or you can deploy into Liberty Core, or you can deploy on Bluemix, or you can take that application and deploy in somebody else's cloud. Now, how do you make that decision? You minimize just the license cost and support cost. In other words, just minimize total cost of acquisition. Well, no, not really. You want to consider all of these other things. You want to consider performance and scalability, management. So by the end of the day, you really should be minimizing total cost of ownership, not total cost of acquisition. So there is a difference. Obviously, downtime could be very, very expensive. Depending on the industry, for 1 hour of downtime, you might be paying millions of dollars. So there has been some high-profile downtimes and outages at different companies where they lost millions of dollars for that downtime. And that's part of the total cost of ownership versus total cost of acquisition. So in this picture, the iceberg is representing the TCO, where the tip of the iceberg is really TCA, total cost of acquisition. That is just the license and support cost. That's very simple to understand, where the bottom part of the iceberg, something that's really difficult to see, is all of this potential downtime cost, management cost, the hardware cost, the administration cost, security, and all of these other things that you need to do to keep your app up and running. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to calculate that precisely. It's more art than a science to do accurate total cost of ownership assessment. But you need that. You need to understand the cost of ownership as well as total cost of acquisition as well. Because of the competitive pressures from open source and commercial vendors, we have made a lot of changes with our products, and some of the things we've made available free of charge. So for instance, the development tools are free of charge for WebSphere. So the Eclipse plugin you can download and use free of charge. You don't have to buy Rational Application Developer if you don't want to. We also provide free development runtime for Liberty for laptop and desktop. And we also provide free support if you have production licenses for your developers. We also have free license for ISVs for Liberty Core. So what that means is, let's imagine I'm an ISV. Let's say I've built my own CRM application, and I build it on top of Liberty Core. And I'm selling it to you as a customer. And you, my customer, you buy my application, but the Liberty Core licenses that I ship with that application are free of charge. If you don't want to pay IBM for those licenses, you don't have to. So in that sense, it's just like Tomcat license. You download it, you use it for free, and you would use forum and documentation to do self-support. But you can also buy support for Liberty Core if you want to. Another thing with Liberty, we have 512 megabyte of memory non-stop running Liberty instance in Bluemix. So you as an individual can run that production, if you wish, up to 512 megabyte in Bluemix in a shared environment. It could be for a company, could be for individual. So for instance, I have my own app that I've built for my Pittsburgh Triathlon Club that I run in Bluemix, and it is free of charge to my club because I don't go above 512 megabyte. We only have a couple of hundred members using that app. What about on-prem? You can also use Liberty on-prem for free up to 2 gigabyte of heap. It could be 4 instances, 512 meg each, or it could be one instance of 2 gigs or 2 instances of 1 gigabyte. Obviously, it's not enough for a large company, but if you're a small company, remember development is free. You can run one instance in QA, 1 gigabyte free of charge, and maybe one instance in production, 1 gigabyte. So that whole thing will be free of charge. You don't have to buy license and support if you don't want to. 2 gigs is not a lot, but it might be enough just to get you started or play with it. IBM has very flexible licensing options. So there are two types of different licenses options. One is perpetual license and one is pay-as-you-go or term license. So perpetual license, something that you buy one time and then you own it forever. You could buy support for year 2, 3, and 4 if you wanted to, but you don't have to. Perpetual licenses are subdivision into different things. One, you can do perpetual licenses core-based, so you license it by the number of cores that you run, or license it by the number of sockets, in this case for WAS base only, or license by the number of users, in this case only Liberty Core or WAS Express, or you could have unlimited license with IBM, which is subject for negotiation. So these are your choices, and as you can see, the WAS Express and Liberty Core, they cost about half of the WAS base, and WAS base is about 1/4 of the cost of WAS ND. So that means Liberty Core is about 8 times cheaper than WAS ND. There is another kind of license which is pay-as-you-go license. So that means it's a rental license, and that license includes the license and support together. And there are different choices ranging from 1 hour in the cloud to 1 day on-prem, 1 month on-prem, 1 year on-prem. And that could be based on number of cores or sockets. In the cloud, it's either number of cores or memory. And that's per hour charge in the cloud. So you can basically buy WebSphere either on Amazon, Microsoft, or IBM clouds, pay by the hour, and that includes hardware and software cost. If you want to run on-prem, you can decide to buy WebSphere for 1 month or 1 year, and that's a rental cost. Or you can bring these licenses into the cloud. So for instance, you can buy 1 month's license and run that in the cloud if you want. And you can do the same with perpetual licenses. Perpetual licenses could be used in the cloud or on-prem. You can read more about this in my blog article that I listed on the very bottom. To compare JBoss and WebLogic and WebSphere in terms of the total cost of acquisition, just the license cost, forget management, forget administration, forget security, downtime, none of the TCO, just the license cost itself, that tip of the iceberg. I created this video, and I'm not going to go through details because you can just watch that video. It's about 20 minutes in itself, where I walk you through the different scenarios where in some of these scenarios you will find WebSphere is cheaper. In some other scenarios, WebLogic or JBoss might be cheaper. So use that calculator and decide which one makes sense. Because of the monthly license cost, let me look at the hypothetical scenario where you have a big workload. So let's say you're a retailer and you have a Black Friday in November where you have a gigantic spike in the workload. And with WebSphere, what you could do, you could buy WebSphere license for certain number of cores, in this case 96, and then you buy monthly license for the additional cost for those 2 months. For 1 month you buy that delta, the small delta, and then for November you buy a bigger delta. And in this case the cost difference between JBoss and WebSphere will be quite significant because you don't have to buy WebSphere for the whole year. And you can also buy WebSphere 1-year license or perpetual with monthly license, so you can combine, mix, and match as long as all of your cores are licensed at any given point of time. Same thing with Oracle. Oracle does not have monthly license, so they would be much more expensive than WebSphere. We have a spreadsheet which you can also download and use, and here's the URL for that spreadsheet, where you could see different costs for WAS and JBoss EAP. And you could see that in most cases WebSphere is cheaper. This is mostly thankfully to the socket-based pricing of WebSphere and 30% performance advantage of WebSphere, because you need fewer hardware cores to run the same workload with WebSphere, and that has been validated by many different customers and workloads. The other reason WebSphere is less expensive than JBoss is because we include a lot of parts. Basically, batteries included, where JBoss comes no batteries included and no handles included either. So with JBoss, if you want to use JBoss Operations Network, you would have to buy a database for John to run that on, and that database has to run on the hardware. You would have to buy load balancer. You would have to find JVM to run it on, maybe free OpenJDK, or you may have to use Oracle JDK. LDAP is not included. Database is not included for HTTP session persistence, nor it is included for the John configuration. Again, a lot of these things, they cost extra with JBoss, and that's what we provide with WebSphere. And by the way, same thing with Tomcat. Support policy between IBM and Red Hat is quite similar. You have to support your entire environment, both QA and production environment. Disaster recovery is free of charge. If you don't run that hot, then you don't have to license disaster recovery. And development is free with Red Hat and with IBM. The difference is, though, is that with IBM, the number of support contacts is unlimited. With Red Hat, you have 2 support contacts for up to 32 cores, and then you get 2 extra support contacts for every extra 32 cores that you license. Forrester Consult reviewed 30 organizations, reviewed the numbers, where they found that on average, the customer was able to save 60 months payback by migrating from JBoss into Liberty Profile. They had 122% ROI, and they had 12% more developer productivity by moving from JBoss into WebSphere Liberty Profile. And again, that was based on 32 organizations in that study. And you can download the white paper published by Forrester Consulting. The previous years, Forrester had done studies on different customers. They also looked at one of the Fortune 100 company in US as well as a government company, and they published those. I have links to those studies on IBMadvantage.com. Now we have the TCO calculator that we created, and you can use the calculator to compare WebSphere on-prem to WebSphere in the cloud, and then you can also add the competitive options so that you can compare what would it cost you to run that environment. Downtime is expensive. You want to avoid downtime as much as possible. Total cost of ownership is not just the license cost. Unfortunately, too many people confuse the cost of the license with the total cost of the system. There is a lot more to the total cost of ownership than just the cost of the system. Now, Red Hat support metrics are similar to IBM or Oracle. You do have to support test and production environments as well. So if you have non-production, you still have to support that with Red Hat. We've done total cost of ownership study. We commissioned a partner, and they've looked at JBoss EAP and WAS-ND, and what they found was that WAS-ND was 35% less expensive than JBoss, considering all of the total cost of ownership steps: operations, management, configuration, administration. You can download the white paper on my blog. Now, if you look at the development effort, and if you are a very large developer-centric company and you have a lot of apps that you're building, then the bulk of your IT expense would really be in development for that application. I've done a simple math comparing 30 Java EE applications, building new 6 applications every year with 110 developers, running all of that on 24 servers. And as you can see, 90% of the cost of this app is really in development. So you really want to get the best development environment and the best runtime like Liberty App Server to have very quick and reliable development environment. We also have done total cost of ownership comparison with Tomcat and TC Server. Again, we had the commissioned third-party research, and they published a study, and you could see that at that time it was still Pivotal. Now it was VMware. Now it's Pivotal. That ROS-base was less expensive than Tomcat TC Server. Oracle has a very strange and unique pricing policy for virtualized environments, where if you only use 2 cores out of 8 in a VMware or KVM environment, they would still charge you for all 8 cores, even though those 6 are not being used, where Pivotal and Red Hat and IBM do not charge for those cores. We only charge for what you're actually using. Except the only exception with Oracle is a Power or other hardware-based hypervisors, but the software-based hypervisors are not recognized by Oracle. So as you could see, the pricing for Oracle, they have support for only hardware-based partitioning, meaning IBM Power VM or Oracle own VM in certain configurations and Solaris containers, but not all configurations. So that's pricing when they recognize 2 cores out of 8 as an example. But for Xen, KVM, Hyper-V, and others, they don't recognize it. For support, when you have a technical issue, they do not recognize VMware or Xen or other environments other than Hyper-V. And what that means is that you would have to reproduce the problem on a native operating system in order to get Oracle support. So that is problematic. The other trouble with Oracle is that a lot of the backup environments have to be licensed. So if you have a DR that is a remote site, even though it may not be operational, you would have to license that with Oracle. With IBM and Red Hat, it's free of charge. If you have warm backup, meaning the cluster is running, but it's not processing transactions, with Oracle, you would have to charge that. With Red Hat and IBM, you do not. If you have a cold backup, meaning it is installed and configured, but it's not running, but if you test the backup, which you should, every month, you have to pay for it. With Oracle, if you do it more than 10 times in a year, it becomes chargeable. With IBM, you don't have to pay for it. So that makes WebLogic very, very expensive very quickly. In terms of support cost, both IBM and Oracle include new version updates as part of the support package. But the difference between IBM and Oracle is that with IBM, the first year of support is included in the price. With Oracle, you have to pay 22% even for the first year. And then for subsequent years, IBM support is 20%, Oracle is 22%. And then Oracle support increases faster than IBM at 4% per year until it reaches the list price. With IBM, it's always a percentage of your entitled price on that year. For certain configuration with IBM, not only the backup servers in case of Oracle are chargeable, but also separate items. Like for instance, in IBM case, we give you database for persistence of HTTP sessions free of charge. We give you LDAP free of charge. You can run HTTP server free of charge. You can run caching servers and even IP sprayers free of charge. With Oracle and JBoss, you would have to buy all of those things. That makes configuration so much more expensive. So to bring it all together for IBM and Oracle, so you could see the columns in here, all of these extra DR environments and then all of the load balancers. Again, you can download that spreadsheet that I showed you a couple of charts ago to calculate the cost for your configuration, but that makes Oracle very, very expensive very quickly. To summarize, comparing WebLogic and WebSphere in terms of the cost, where you could see we run a little bit faster than Oracle depending on the workload and depending on the hardware, could be twice as fast, could be 30% faster, could be 20% faster. We provide extra administration tools, health management, intelligent management, and many other things that you don't get with Oracle or JBoss or Tomcat for that matter. And we also bundle HTTP server, LDAP, and load balancer free of charge with WasND, something that you have to buy with WebLogic, as well as JBoss and others as well. So WebSphere is less expensive in most cases. The total cost of ownership is not just the license cost, it's more than the license cost. Think about the hidden part of the iceberg when you consider about the total cost of ownership. It doesn't mean that open source can never be used because it becomes too expensive to manage. I mean, a lot of customers make successful use. They're quite happy with open source. They figured out how to use it. But I would argue that the cost of running that open source is not necessarily lower. It might be the same, or maybe in many cases even higher than running those same workloads on WebSphere. Think about total cost of ownership. Thank you for getting this far in the presentation. Hopefully you found it useful. Check out my blog, ibmadvantage.com. I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you and good luck.